You believe you think for yourself. You believe your preferences, beliefs, fears, they're yours. You like what you like. You want what you want. You fear what you fear. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the surface, a quiet question lingers. Where did all that come from? From the moment you opened your eyes to the world, it was already talking to you. Before you could walk, it was whispering. Before you could argue, it had already decided what you would believe. Be good. Sit still. That's not for you. People like us don't do that. You should be ashamed. You didn't choose these ideas. They were planted. And because they came before choice, they entered as truth. Psychologists call it introjection, the unconscious adoption of someone else's voice, someone else's morality, someone else's limitations. Not because you were weak, but because you were small and safety depended on acceptance. So you didn't evaluate these voices. You obeyed them. Your mind became a recording studio for the voices around you. Parents, teachers, media, culture. They wrote the script. You became an actor. You were praised for repeating the lines, punished for improvising. So you learned the rhythm, memorized the melody, and somewhere along the way, you mistook the voice in your head for your own. But what if it isn't? Plato spoke of a cave where people lived chained, facing shadows on the wall, mistaking illusion for reality. But what he didn't say is that we're not just watching the shadows. We've become them. Our minds shaped in darkness, our truths cast by flickering projections from behind. Louis Althusser, decades ago, warned that ideology doesn't just exist in books or laws. It exists in school bells, in prayers, in uniforms, in slogans, systems, designed not to crush you, but to shape you before you could resist. He called these mechanisms ideological state apparatuses, the gentle ones, the kind ones, the ones that smile as they shape. They don't tell you what to think. They teach you how to think. They don't demand control. They create the illusion of choice. And by the time you're old enough to question any of it, it's already become you. Think of the beliefs you cling to, about success, about love, about what matters. Who taught you those? And more importantly, when? Because if they arrived before you were capable of consent, how can you be sure they're yours? The world didn't just teach you language, it wrote the operating system of your mind. As a child, you heard a voice from the radio, from the pulpit, from behind the desk, distorted, unrelenting. You tried to turn it off, but every time you did, another voice turned on. One told you what a real man does. Another told you what a proper woman feels. Another said there are two paths in life, success or shame. Another whispered that wanting too much was selfish, that dream was dangerous, that you, in your rawness, were not enough. So you stopped turning off the voices. You started obeying them. And then you started repeating them. You told others what you had once been told. You corrected, shamed, measured. You passed down the script like a sacred text, convinced it was your own creation. The child became the adult, now confident, even proud, of the same whispers that once entered unnoticed. And just like that, the system won, because now you are the voice. You don't need to be watched. You've learned to watch yourself. But something cracks, a flicker, a sliver of doubt. And that's where the unraveling begins. Let's trace it back. Before obedience, before the slogans, before the pride. Let's ask, where did the voice begin? And more importantly, who put it there? Why do we obey? Not just laws or leaders, but symbols, rituals, scripts written in invisible ink, commands we never remember hearing, but somehow know by heart. We stand when the anthem plays. We bow, our heads when told to pray. We raise our hands when the teacher demands silence. No one holds a gun to our heads, and yet we move like someone does. The answer isn't in the threat. It's in the inheritance. Obedience begins before understanding, before logic, before language. It's in the way a dog salivates at a bell, long after the food has stopped coming. Ivan Pavlov discovered that you don't need reason to control behavior, just repetition and reward, a stimulus, a response. Over time, the body learns what the mind does not. But Pavlov's dog was just the beginning. B.F. Skinner built a world of boxes, little metal chambers where pigeons learn to peck, rats learn to press, and humans learn to comply. He called it operant conditioning, the science of shaping behavior through reward and punishment. But what Skinner understood, and what society perfected, was that you don't need cages to create obedience. You just need consequences. Praise, shame, likes, silence. And soon we don't act because we want to. We act because we've been trained to. It's not just animals. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch gathered groups of students for what they believed was a vision test. But there was a trick. Everyone in the room, except one, was in on the experiment. They were told to give wrong answers, simple questions, obvious answers. And yet, when the majority spoke falsehoods, the lone subject, unsure, anxious, conformed. Again and again he gave answers he knew were wrong, not because he believed them, but because he couldn't bear to stand alone. Then came Stanley Milgram. After the horrors of World War II, he asked a terrifying question. Could ordinary people be made to do extraordinary harm? In his now infamous study, participants were told to administer electric shocks to a stranger whenever they answered a question incorrectly. The shocks weren't real. The screams were fake. But the obedience? That was real. 65% of participants went all the way, believing they were inflicting deadly pain, simply because an authority figure in a lab coat told them to. These weren't monsters. They were teachers, salesmen, fathers, sons. They weren't broken. They were normal, and that's the terror. Obedience is not an exception. It's a design. We inherit it. We refine it. We pass it on. You can see it in the marching soldier whose orders drown out his own morality, in the employee nodding at a CEO's lies during a boardroom presentation, in the algorithm prompting you to click, scroll, buy, not because you chose to, but because you were nudged just enough. We are puppets. But the hands pulling the strings are not people. They are systems, flags, brands, school crests, uniforms, the corner office, the glowing screen, the voice that says, "This is how it's done." The script that punishes those who question, and we obey. Not out of loyalty, but inertia. Because somewhere in our past, someone clapped when we complied. Someone frowned when we resisted. The conditioning stuck, and the world never had to ask again. But here's the most chilling part. The strings don't need to be pulled. Not anymore. We pull them ourselves. We've learned to internalize the commands. We feel guilt when we question, anxiety when we deviate, pride when we conform. So the theater goes on, the puppets dance, and no one notices that the puppeteer is gone. But what happens when the strings begin to fray, when the curtain slips, and the authority behind the system is revealed to be hollow? What happens when obedience no longer feels like virtue but betrayal? That moment is coming. And when it does, everything you thought was structure might begin to collapse. What if what you called love was really a test of compliance? As children, we learn quickly what earns affection. A smile when we obey. A cold shoulder when we rebel. Approval is rationed like oxygen, and the message is clear: be good or be alone. Psychologists call it attachment theory. At its core is something simple and terrifying: the idea that our sense of safety, and even identity, is shaped by our earliest bonds. Not just whether we were loved, but how we were loved. Were we accepted for who we were, or for how well we fit the script? Freud believed love was never pure, that children learn morality not through reasoning, but through fear. Fear of losing the love they depend on. He called it the superego, the internalized authority figure. The parent becomes a phantom voice, whispering judgment even in their absence. Donald Winnicott later built on this, warning that many children never become their true selves. Instead, they perform a false self, a version curated to please, to adapt, to survive. The child smiles on cue, say the right words, draws inside the lines, and over time forgets there were ever lines to question. But it doesn't stop in the home. School teaches that love comes through achievement. Religion teaches that love is earned through submission. Nations teach that love of country means silence in the face of its crimes. In each case, love is conditional. It is a currency, a contract, and its cost is obedience. This isn't love. It's a deal disguised as devotion. Consider the myth of Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods to give it to humanity. He did it out of love, out of compassion, and for that, he was chained to a rock and punished eternally. The message is ancient and enduring: to love humanity, to disobey authority. These are crimes. Our world is full of Promethean figures. Whistleblowers, dissidents, artists who speak truths are too raw, children who ask questions, adults fear. Each punished not for hatred, but for a love that refuses to obey. We are taught to confuse control with care, to see restriction as protection, to believe that punishment comes from a place of concern. So we internalize the bars of the cage, thinking they keep us safe. A teacher gives you a gold star. A priest blesses your confession. A parent tells you, they're proud, but only when you follow the rules. You hold the paper heart they gave you, cut from your test scores, your church attendance, your rank and file, and then one day you watch it burn, not out of rebellion, but recognition. Because the moment you realize love was conditioned on your silence, that's the moment the betrayal becomes clear. And when love feels like betrayal, the mind begins to fracture. Not because it's weak, but because it was lied to. Now the question is no longer, what do I believe? Who taught me to believe it? The mask is cracking, and behind it, something darker waits, the systemic force that built the cage and called it care. You think you're awake. You think you've broken free. You see through the lies, the manipulation, the spectacle. You raise your voice. You protest. You resist. But what if the system saw that coming? What if the rebellion you cling to was scripted before you even knew you'd resist? In the early 20th century, a man named Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, pioneered a new form of manipulation. He didn't call it propaganda. That word had become too obvious, too crude. He called it public relations. Bernays believed people were irrational and emotional, and that if you understood their desires, you could control their decisions, not with facts, but with feelings. Sell them identity, not product. Loyalty, not logic. Want a woman to smoke? Make it a symbol of liberation. Want a nation to go to war? Make it about virtue, not violence. Bernays didn't invent propaganda. He just made it invisible. Decades later, Noam Chomsky would call this the manufacturing of consent, the process by which democratic societies engineer agreement. Not by suppressing dissent, but by shaping the very categories of thought. You don't silence opposition, you just pre-filter the options. Offer only approved disagreements. Because if you can frame the question, the answer doesn't matter. This is the genius of systems of control. They don't need to crush you. They just need to curate your outrage. Even revolution can be a product. Branded, monetized, tamed. We live in an age where rebellion is aesthetic. T-shirts scream, resist. Algorithms deliver pre-packaged dissent. Your anger trends for 24 hours before it's folded back into the culture machine. Marshall McLuhan once warned, "The medium is the message. It's not just what you say, it's how you say it. And more importantly, who owns the platform on which you say it?" So you scream into a megaphone, but the megaphone was built by the same hands that built the prison. This is how ideology works, not as a conscious lie, but as an invisible frame, a lens you don't know you're wearing, a narrative so deep you mistake it for truth. Even your resistance is a program. Ask yourself, when you choose a side, did you choose it, or were you funneled into it? Why do the most radical movements always have merchandise? Why are the loudest critics the ones with the biggest followings, all underwritten by the same corporate sponsors they claim to oppose? Because systems don't just fight dissent. They feed on it. They repackage it. They turn revolution into theater. You thought you were breaking out. But the room you smashed your way into was another cell. And then the paranoia begins. Not the theatrical kind, not conspiracy boards and string on the wall, but something deeper, subtler, a whisper in your mind. What if the enemy isn't out there? What if the real battlefield has always been inside? The mind is not a fortress, it's a theater. And the empire didn't just conquer the land. It rewrote the script playing behind your eyes. You were told to find yourself, to build an identity, to define who you are. But no one warned you that the tools they gave you were mirrors, not windows. And every time you thought you'd discovered who you were only tracing the reflection someone else designed. So you began the journey. Career, purpose, love, aesthetics. You curated a self, sculpted from likes, resumes, achievements, and belonging. You played roles so convincingly, even though you forgot it was theater. But somewhere, in the quiet, between performances, you started to feel it. The fracture. The sense that the center wouldn't hold. Jung once wrote that the ego, the conscious I, is just a tiny island in the ocean of the unconscious. It's not the true self, but a mask, forged in response to your environment, an interface between what you are and what the world demands. So you wear the mask, the archetype, the hero, the rebel, the parent, the victim, the savior. But, deep down, something watches, and it knows the mask isn't you. Then there's Lacan. He spoke of the mirror stage, a moment in early childhood when we first see our reflection and mistake that image for who we are. But what if that mirror never broke? What if your entire life has been lived in pursuit of coherence with a self that never really existed? Think about modern life, social media, branding, avatars. You are not just observed, you are performing. Constantly. Even solitude becomes spectacle. We no longer ask, "Who am I?" We ask, "How do I look doing it?" Because the mirror isn't just in the bathroom anymore. It's in your pocket. And it stares back all day. You identify with labels, nationality, gender, career, ideology, trauma, tribe. But these identities are like clothes you're told you picked, but were really handed at birth, stitched from family scripts and cultural blueprints. Each one feels like a home, until it doesn't. So you switch, change your look, move cities, redefine your pronouns, your politics, your passions. You break one mirror, only to run headfirst into another. Every reflection promises clarity, but all you get is noise. This is the trap of the constructed self. It gives you just enough illusion of control to keep you chasing, but never arriving. And when the mirrors start to crack, when the archetypes collapse, when the ego you built can no longer contain the contradictions, the disintegration begins. It's not just confusion, it's grief. Grief for the person you thought you were, for the stories you told, for the meaning you clung to. And yet, paradoxically, this unraveling is the most honest moment you've ever had. Because beneath the roles, Beneath the reflections, there is something watching, something wordless, something untouched by approval or identity. But the ego doesn't go quietly. It clings, it panics. It tells you that without your reflection, you are nothing. Without a mask, no one will love you. But love that needs a mask was never love. So you stand in the glass room, surrounded by shards of who you thought you were. Influencer, genius, parents, outcast, saint, monster. And for the first time, you stop trying to put the pieces back together. You let the mirrors fall, because you're starting to suspect. What lies beyond reflection isn't emptiness. It's true, and the truth doesn't wear a name tag. As the dust settles, you feel the void beneath the mask begin to open. But what feels like an ending may be the first moment you've actually existed. And now, the mirror is gone. The question is no longer, who am I? Who is asking? And that is where the real terror begins. There comes a point in unraveling where even language fails. You've broken the mirrors, abandoned the masks, watched the scaffolding of the self fall into dust, and yet something remains. Not a voice, not an identity, but a presence. This is the moment the mind begins to panic, because it's no longer leading, it's observing. Krishnamurti once said, "The ability to observe without evaluating is the highest form of intelligence." But what does it mean to observe when there is no observer? In the teachings of Laozi, silence is not absent. It is the origin, the Tao that cannot be named, a state beyond intellect, beyond labels, a state that simply is. Alan Watts called it the backward step, not the pursuit of knowledge, but the surrender of the knower. When you stop identifying with thoughts, you begin to notice the space between them, and in that space is peace. Not the peace of agreement, but the stillness that precedes all conflict. Not a conclusion, but an awareness. You realize you've spent your life trying to become something, to be seen, to be validated, to be defined, but it became a cage. Being is the escape. You sit, you listen, and for the first time you don't chase the thought. You don't run from the silence. And then something strange happens. The programming dissolves. The internal monologue quiets. The voices, the ones that told you who to be, what to want, how to live, fade into static. And what's left isn't a new identity. It's not enlightenment or awakening or some final truth. It's just this, a breath, a heartbeat, a moment. And in that moment, you realize you've been searching for something that was never missing. The silence wasn't the end. It was the beginning, because now, for the first time, you are not reacting. You are not repeating. You are not obeying. You are aware. And from that awareness, something dangerous comes up. Something powerful. Choice. Real choice. The kind that no system, no parent, no algorithm can make for you. The silence has spoken, and now you are ready to listen. You were told you had a choice, that your life was a blank canvas, waiting for your unique signature. But what if the hand that guided your pen was never yours? Spinoza believed that freedom was not the absence of necessity, but the understanding of it. That we are not free by defying our nature, but by recognizing the chains that bind us. Chains forged from biology, family, culture, and history. Schopenhauer put it more bleakly. A man can do what he wants, but not want what he wants. Desire, he argued, arises uninvited. Choice then becomes a slave to impulse, to a will that was never consulted. Modern neuroscience deepens the wound. In 1983, Benjamin Libet's experiments revealed that the brain prepares to act hundreds of milliseconds before we become consciously aware of the decision. The hand moves, and the mind follows. Free will, it seems, arrives late to its own party. But perhaps the question isn't whether we are free. Perhaps the real question is, What happens when you become aware of the script? Imagine a switchboard, 100 lights blinking, each connected to a reflex, a bias, a belief. For years, the system ran automatically. Decisions were made not through reflection, but reaction. Then, one light flickers. It dims. You notice it. You don't just react. You pause. In that pause, you realize something radical. You were not choosing. You were executing, not rebelling, repeating, not living, performing, but awareness cracks the cycle. It doesn't erase the wiring. It just gives you access. You start to see when a thought is not yours, when a belief is inherited, when an impulse is planted. You don't destroy them. You simply stop obeying without question. Freedom, then, is not the ability to do whatever you want. It's the clarity to ask where that want came from. Not every reflex can be rewired. Not every illusion can be unlearned. But awareness, true, sustained awareness, creates space. And in that space, a new kind of decision can be made. One, not dictated by fear, guilt, or programming, not rebellion for its own sake. Not escape into the opposite illusion, but a quiet, grounded recognition that you are holding the switch now. The system still hums, the lights still blink, but you are no longer a passenger. You have stepped behind the curtain. And for the first time, you can ask, not what the world wants from you, but what you want from yourself. Because the choice that was never given is now the one you get to make, and it begins right here. Right now, she entered your mind before you had a choice, before you knew what language was, before you could form a sentence. She was already speaking through lullabies, rules, and rituals, through gestures you mimicked before you understood their meaning. She was there in the smile you gave to be approved, in the silence you held to be accepted. She is not a person. She is older than memory. She is the system behind the system, a convergence of voices. Your mother's warning, your teacher's praise, your culture's commandments. She is the algorithm that shaped your preferences, the myth behind your morality, the ghost behind your goals. She spoke to you in the voice of safety. Don't say that. Don't question that. Don't go there. Be good. Be useful. Be normal. And you listened because you had to. You didn't know it was a whisper. You thought it was true. But now, the whisper is faint. Not because she's gone, but because you're finally listening. You begin to hear her in moments you once called instinct. When you apologize before you're sure you're wrong. When you laugh with the group, though you don't agree. When you reach for your phone not to connect, but to escape. She still whispers, "Don't ruin everything. Don't be alone. Don't wake up." But this time, something is different. You're not resisting her. That only feeds her. You're watching her, naming her, tracing her voice back to the roots. And as you do, something extraordinary happens. She no longer defines the borders of your mind. She becomes a sound among many, a suggestion, not a command. Now you walk through the world with open eyes, not certain, but aware, not fearless, but free to question your fear. You know she still whispers, but you also know you do not have to follow. Freedom is not a shout. It's a silence. A stillness that asks nothing of you. A space between what you've been told and what you choose to become. And in that stillness, the question returns. Who are you without her voice? You will walk many paths. Some will circle back to her. Others will vanish into the unknown. But now, the path you take is not automatic. Not inherited, not programmed. The whisper will never stop completely. But now, for the first time, you are listening with your own ears, and that is where everything begins. Not in rebellion, not in reaction, but in the quiet power of choosing. On your terms, she is still whispering, but now, so are you.